Merhaba herkese. Bugünkü konuğumuz Peter Adamson, Münih Üniversitesi Geç Antik Çağ ve Arap Felsefesi Profesörü. Welcome, Professor Adamson.
Hi there. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for joining us today. Professor Adamson, can you please introduce yourself to your audiences in Turkey briefly?
Sure. I can do it to your audience in Turkey, although I can't do it in Turkish. Sorry. So let's go with English. Right, my name is Peter Adamson, as you just said. I'm originally from the United States. I grew up in Boston, but now I live in Munich, in Germany, and I teach at the LMU, the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität in Munich, where I'm professor of late ancient and Arabic philosophy. Before I was in Munich, I spent 12 years at King's College London in the UK, and I'm actually still connected to them, but my main job is here in Munich. And most of my work has been about, well, the areas mentioned in the name of my professorship. So late ancient philosophy, especially Neoplatonism, and philosophy in the Islamic world. I, early on in my career, did a lot of work on Al-Kindi, who's the first, or usually thought of as the first philosopher to write in Arabic in the 9th century CE, so 3rd century Hijra. And my first book was about the translation of a Neoplatonist named Plotinus in his circle, so in Al-Kindi's translation circle. And then I went on to publish a book about Al-Kindi, and I did a book of translations with my colleague Peter Porman of Al-Kindi's philosophical works. And since then, I've worked on a lot of other stuff, especially Ibn Sina and his reception in the 12th and 13th centuries CE. But at the same time, I also do work on Greek philosophy, which is maybe less interesting to your audience, but I did that too.
I think we may say the opposite. Maybe there are many people here who are also interested in Greek philosophy, because Greek Arabic studies has been quite popular in lately, let's say. My first question is going to be this: what made you interested in philosophy in the Islamic world in general, and late antiquity also?
Yeah, so I think there's sort of two things. One is that I wanted to be a historian of philosophy after I did my undergraduate degree, and I was pretty open about what period of philosophy I would work on. So I already liked ancient philosophy, but I was also doing some work on medieval literature. So I was really interested in Dante and his Divine Comedy. That's what my undergraduate thesis was about. And so I just thought it would be interesting to do medieval philosophy, partially because I thought that there'd probably be more like work still to be done on medieval philosophy than, say, Plato and Aristotle, who I assume would be pretty well researched already, which is kind of true. I mean, obviously it's still worth doing research on Plato and Aristotle, but if you're looking for things that are really new to work on, then the medieval period is obviously like a big underexplored area. And then I learned Arabic basically for that reason as well. So I thought, well, if Latin medieval philosophy is underexplored, then Arabic medieval philosophy even more so, which I have to say, this was all like without the benefit of knowing anything at all, right? I was 21 years old. We should bear in mind there wasn't really an internet yet. So it wasn't that easy to find out what there was, especially, you know, at my undergraduate college, we only had a pretty small library. So I didn't really know how vast the literature in these areas would have been, but it was a good guess. So that was one thing. The other thing, and this might be relevant to some stuff we're going to get on to talk about, I've always been attracted by philosophy that from a contemporary modern perspective looks kind of strange or counterintuitive. And Neoplatonism absolutely qualifies for that. So the world of Neoplatonism is a very different world than the one we live in, or I should say maybe their philosophical approach is very different from modern day philosophical approaches and the things that most people would find kind of intuitive or immediately reasonable or plausible. And I just thought it was so interesting that there was this massive dominant intellectual tradition that went for centuries and centuries. I mean, Neoplatonism was basically the main force in late ancient philosophy and remained influential throughout the whole medieval period right up to the Renaissance. So we're talking about more than 1,000 years of philosophy. And I just thought it was so fascinating that a philosophy that seemed weird from our perspective was dominant for such a long time. And I wanted to understand that.
Then this brings me to my third question and the main question, basically. Given your interest in these philosophies, we would like to learn your opinion. Does Islamic philosophy or does Arabic philosophy have value today outside the archive, outside its value as an archival material?
Yeah. So I guess the first thing I'd want to say about that is that we shouldn't dismiss what you're calling the archival aspect. So, I mean, if by that you mean, well, it's merely a historical phenomenon, right? I mean, if we think about normal history, like why do we try to understand whatever the history of ancient Persia, right? So people sometimes say, oh, you can kind of learn from history lessons that would apply to the current day or whatever. But I mean, nobody's studying ancient Persia because they think that it will affect, United States foreign policy. And if they are, they're being silly, right? So, but on the other hand, it seems to me absolutely insane to say that there's no reason to know about ancient Persia, right? So I think similarly with history of philosophy, historians of philosophy are sometimes put on the defensive because this whole conversation about why are we doing this starts from the presumption that the merely historical is not interesting, right? But actually, I think for most people who aren't professional philosophers, the merely historical is interesting. Like they want to know what Plato and Aristotle and Sina and Descartes and Kant, they want to know what they thought, right? People are interested in this, and I don't think we should dismiss that, actually. But that's not an answer to your question. I just wanted to say that kind of as a preface to answer your question. Okay, so as far as answering your actual question goes, I would say that 3 things come to mind for me. And the first is maybe not so much the content of the philosophy itself, but the mere, what you might call the mere existence of this philosophical tradition, or actually multiple traditions in the Islamic world. So especially here in Europe, but also in North America, so in the English-speaking world in general, there's a pretty strong tendency for people to think that philosophy is fundamentally a European phenomenon, right? So it was invented in Greece, and then if they think of who are the famous philosophers, they think, well, the Greek philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, then maybe the next one they would think of is Aquinas. So already a problem there because we just jumped, almost 2,000 years by going from Aristotle to Aquinas. So something's gone wrong there already, but leaving that aside, then we move on to whatever Descartes, Hume, Hegel, Kant, right? And obviously these are all interesting philosophers, but they're not a very diverse range of human beings, right? They're all white, male, aristocratic Europeans. And so there's all kinds of ways that one can challenge that narrative. You can look at women philosophers in the European tradition. You can look at non-white philosophers, both in Europe and North America, around the world. But maybe the easiest and most straightforward way to challenge that approach to philosophy is to point out that there was philosophy outside of Europe, right? So there's Chinese philosophy, there's Indian philosophy, there's African philosophy, and there's philosophy in the Islamic world. So immediately there's a kind of politically important point to be made here, which is that the pursuit of wisdom, science, philosophy, these are not things that Europe has a kind of monopoly on. And that's even without getting into more complicated points like the fact that actually Greek philosophy began in Turkey, not in Greece. because the first pre-Socratics lived on the coast of what is now the Turkish coast of the Mediterranean, right? So depending on whether you think that's Europe or not, right? Even Greek philosophy is not originally European. But again, leaving that aside, I think it's important, first of all, just to establish philosophy as a global phenomenon. So philosophy is a human enterprise. And that's important for the nature of philosophy. It's also important politically and culturally. And then along the same lines, in philosophy of the Islamic world, we have a unique case because unlike Chinese and Indian philosophy in the Islamic world was extremely closely involved with the traditions of European philosophy. So they translate Greek philosophy into Arabic, like I was talking about. I worked on that early in my career, especially. It's also very influential, that is, philosophy in Arabic is very influential on Latin medieval philosophy and philosophy in the Renaissance even. So there's very close connections and a lot of exchange of ideas between what you might call Europe and the Islamic world, which isn't really true for ancient Chinese or Indian philosophy. I mean, it's not true at all for those traditions. So it's kind of a special case, actually, because it's both what you might call a global philosophical tradition and non-European tradition. Like Ibn Sina, who's the most important figure in that tradition, who we sometimes call Avicenna in English. He's living in Central Asia, right? But on the other hand, he's reading Aristotle, and his whole philosophy is constructed as a response to Aristotle. So there you see that you can use philosophy in the Islamic world to kind of break down this hard barrier between European and non-European philosophy. And there's some other points you could make along the same lines. So for example, most medieval Jewish philosophy was written in Arabic in the Islamic world. And there's a very productive exchange of ideas between Muslims and Jews in the Middle Ages. And that's an important point to make, especially now with all the political events that we're seeing, right? So none of this is to really get into what ideas were developed in the Islamic world. It's just sort of saying, well, the existence of this tradition and the nature of it, its historical character, has a lot of lessons that are important for the contemporary world, I would say. So that's the first thing. Should I go on, or do you want to ask me anything?
No, you can go on, I think.
Okay, so second thing is that there are a lot of ideas in the Islamic world that one could take directly as inspiration for contemporary concerns, right? And in particular, I think especially in the Islamic world itself, including in Turkey, actually, but also like in Egypt and in other places, especially in the Maghreb, there have been quite a few attempts to go back to what they sometimes call their own tradition, to take political inspiration from figures like Sayyid Farabi or Ibn Khaldun, right? So not for nothing is there's even a university in Turkey called Ibn Khaldun University in Istanbul, yes. Right? So this is not just because, oh, he's some famous guy, right? Ibn Khaldun, because he's an empirically oriented historian and political thinker, or Al-Farabi because he's a very deep political thinker. These are figures to whom one can turn for addressing contemporary political concerns. And actually, this is not a new phenomenon. So even in the early 20th century, so like 100 years ago and more, even maybe at the end of the 19th century, there were a lot of discussions sort of in the context of the failing and then collapsed Ottoman Empire. There were a lot of discussions about effectively why is the Islamic world losing this global battle for dominance to the Europeans, right? And one thing that you see sometimes is the idea that this sort of speaking from the point of view of the Muslim world, right? So we should turn to Europe and take over whatever ideas are dominant there, like positivism or Marxism, etc. So those ideas were very influential in the Islamic world. But then there was also, to some extent, in tension with that, an attempt to turn to figures like Ibn Khaldun or Al-Farabi and say, no, this will give us the political theory that will allow us to like catch up with Europe or compete with Europe. And that idea has not gone away, I think. I mean, you might know more about it than I do, but that's like a very direct application of political theories from Islam to modern day political concerns. Similarly, if you think about something like philosophy of religion, so if you're Muslim and you believe in God and so on, you believe in the prophecy of Muhammad, then that belief system raises all kinds of philosophical issues, right? So for example, what's the relationship between reason and revelation? Can you prove that God exists? And so on and so forth. And actually, if you look back into the tradition, you find that approaches to religion in Islam were extremely rationalist for the most part, not only in falsafa, sort of philosophy, but also in kalam. So kalam is Islamic theology, right? And right back, all the way back to, the 8th, 9th century, the very beginnings of kalam, the mutakallimun, the theologians, are very rationalist in their approach to Islamic religion. So they think that God's existence can be proven. They even think that you can use reason to establish that Muhammad was a genuine prophet. So unlike what you see often in the Christian tradition, there's a just kind of almost universal assumption among Islamic intellectuals that Islam is a rational religion, so that there's a complete merging between reason and religion, and then you can use reason to establish the truth of Islam, which means that actually Islam is a religion that lends itself very well to philosophy of religion, or maybe I should say that the history of theology and philosophy in Islam fits very well with philosophy of religion, right? So that's just a couple of examples. So we talked about politics, we talked about philosophy of religion, and you could look at other areas like ethics, epistemology, and so on. So, I mean, these are all ideas that are not of merely antiquarian interest, but remain relevant, right? And those are examples of cases where you have like really core areas of debate within the historical tradition that have been and still are being like revived for use in contemporary world. The third area, which is not completely dissimilar, but I would still make a distinction here, is that you can also go back into the Islamic philosophical tradition for really surprising or kind of off the beaten path material. So what I was just talking about was pretty obvious, right? Like Ibn Khaldun and Al-Farabi, hugely important political thinkers. So why not look at their political philosophy, right? Or, reason and religion, obviously a core issue in Kalam. But you can also, because the Islamic philosophical tradition is so rich, you can also find authors addressing topics that weren't really central at the time, but have become very important to us. And my favorite example here would be philosophy of animals. And the reason I'm bringing up this example is that we just had a big research project on it here in Munich that ran for 5 years. And a team of people together with me looked at many, many authors and what they had to say about animals. And we found that these authors have lots to say about the minds of animals, the nature of animals, and also animal ethics, and often approached the topic in a way that would really inform modern day discussions of animals. So for example, you find texts that have an approach to animal ethics, which encourages the benevolent treatment of animals, but for different reasons than what you would find in the modern day literature on animal ethics, because they weren't utilitarians, right? So they have other arguments for why you should be benevolent towards animals. So that would be, I think, another interesting way in which philosophy in the Islamic world could kind of feed into our modern day political discussion, or sorry, philosophical discussions. So not the most obvious things, but these sort of lesser or less noticed features of the tradition. And just a last thought in answer to your question, I think as that example shows, in a way, like your question was a reasonable one. Like, okay, what can philosophy in the Islamic world tell us that would be interesting today, right? But that's kind of like saying, what can European philosophy tell us that's interesting today, right? I mean, philosophy in the Islamic world goes back to the 9th century. So it's been going on for more than a millennium. It's still going on now. And I think that people, maybe because they would like turn to, you know, sort of standard reference works on the history of philosophy, and they would see, oh, okay, philosophy in the Islamic world, that's basically like 5 guys. So Kindi, Farabi, Ibn Sina, Ghazali, Ibn Rushd, right? And then maybe they'd add a Jewish philosopher like Maimonides. And that would sort of be philosophy in the Islamic world, right? That's what you might, if you were lucky, you might get taught that in a philosophy degree, right? But actually, of course, there are hundreds and hundreds of philosophers in the Islamic world, you know, again, stretching over more than a millennium. I mean, actually thousands, right? But in terms of thinkers who are, I would say, prominent enough to be worth studying, you have many dozens, just as you do in Europe. And so it would be very surprising if there were only 1 or 2 ideas from the Islamic world that would be worth our attention. Actually, there's no end to it, right? It's just an ocean of material that we're still only kind of getting grips on as historians of philosophy. So there's a lot to be done. And I think that 50, 100 years from now, we'll know a lot more about it than we do now.
Okay. So another question, which is which your speech invoked in me right now. So you have just talked about the importance of non-mainstream philosophical traditions with respect to the European philosophy, and also with respect to the non-European philosophy as well. So there are also mainstream Islamic philosophers, and there are other ways to do it, off the beaten path, you use this word. So what is your opinion on the question of the non-European philosophy in general? So when we talk about Islamic philosophy, we are still talking about the Platonic Aristotelian tradition. So what can we say about a philosophy which has nothing to do with this tradition? So I know that you have works on Indian philosophy and other philosophy, so I'd like to hear you about this.
Yeah, first thing is that what I just said about philosophy in the Islamic world also goes for India and China. So like with China, if you ask people who don't know very much about it, or maybe even philosophy students, tell me what you know about Chinese philosophy. They might say, well, there's Confucius, and maybe there's some other philosophical traditions that disagree with Confucianism. They might know that. Maybe if they've actually taken a course on it, they might say, okay, well, there were the following 5 or 6 schools in ancient China. There's Moism and Confucianism, and right. So they might give you Taoism. They might give you a kind of story about ancient Chinese philosophy, and that would be, of course, a very good answer, right? But again, not that I know a lot about this, but it's not like China stopped existing in the 2nd century BCE, right? So Chinese philosophy keeps going on and on and on and on down to the present day, right? So to get from Confucius to Marxism, right? That's a massive enterprise. And again, I think people always think that something like Chinese or Indian philosophy is maybe comparable to classical Greek philosophy, right? So just as we have Plato and Aristotle in Europe, we have the Tao Te Ching and Kongzi, so Confucius, in China, right? And although that's a valid comparison, Chinese philosophy as a whole is more comparable to European philosophy as a whole, right? In fact, Chinese philosophy is older than European philosophy and has gone on this entire time. And the same is true in India, right? So in India, you have this fundamental distinction between Vedic and Buddhist philosophy, and you have the Vedic schools, which become dominant, especially because Buddhism kind of wanders out of India and spreads across the rest of Asia, right? So just as you have like Confucianism in antiquity, but then you have Neo-Confucianism and many different approaches to the Confucian tradition in China. So you have, just to take one example, in classical India or ancient India, you have a logical tradition called the Nyaya school. And then later on, you have something called Navya Nyaya, which means new Nyaya. So attempts to revise and adapt the original Nyaya logic in response to pressures from critiques and other worries, right, as the tradition develops. And again, these traditions go on for centuries and centuries. They go on right up to the modern day, right? Obviously, it's not like we have a completely unbroken tradition here. So especially in the case of India, after a while, India is invaded by Islamic forces, and so you have Mughal India. So Indian philosophy actually becomes part of philosophy in the Islamic world for several centuries, which is something people don't usually think about, right? And then you have Western colonialism, so the British colonial enterprise, and all that has a huge impact on what's going on philosophically in India. But again, that's all part of the story of philosophy in India, right? So the main thing I would say about all of these topics, and I could say something similar about African philosophy, by the way, the main thing I would say about all of these topics is that people massively underestimate how huge the topic is. So you could spend your entire life thinking about just a tiny bit of the Chinese philosophical tradition, like just Chinese philosophy from the 12th to the 15th century CE or something like that. That would be something a scholar could devote their entire life to, right? And these are topics that don't really register in people's awareness, and that's why they think that these traditions are much smaller than the European philosophical tradition, because they can name a lot more European philosophers than they can name Chinese or Indian philosophers or African philosophers. One could also make the same point about Latin America, by the way. So you have like Mesoamerican philosophical traditions, then you have a similar transitional period through the arrival of colonialism, and then you have Latin American philosophy since the 16th century or so, responding to European philosophy, right? In Spanish and Portuguese mostly. So these are all traditions that are very large, and really trying to understand them all would be more than the work of a single lifetime. And so I think that's maybe the main thing I would say about them, is that they're just huge in terms of their extent chronologically, the number of texts, the number of authors. The other thing I would say is that people, even if people kind of understood that, I think there's also a tendency for people to associate a relatively small number of ideas with each tradition. So for example, they might think, oh, Indian philosophy, that's kind of about the question of whether everything is one principle, like Brahman, right? And whether they're monists, right? Or they might think of the Buddhist theory that the self doesn't exist as a single existing thing across time, right? So these are important points. So these are worth thinking about. But classical Indian philosophy alone addresses all philosophical topics. So there, like I said, there's logic, there's epistemology, there's political philosophy, there's ethics, there's everything, right? And I think that's generally true for these global traditions, is that you can find material in all of them to address any philosophical topic that you're interested in. So if you're a political philosopher, if you're an ethicist, if you're an epistemologist, if you're a metaphysician, you can find things to look at in China, in India, in Latin America, in Africa, and of course in the Islamic world. So these are all very rich, not just historically, but also conceptually. They really cover the entire range of philosophical topics. And so it's a mistake to restrict any of these traditions to just one little bit of the history in terms of the chronological period. But it's also a mistake to think, for example, that Chinese philosophy is all about ethics, which is something people do often think, but it's not true. They have philosophy of language, they have epistemology, they have philosophy of science. So, there's just so much to find out and to know. And I think that's daunting and kind of intimidating, but it's really important to communicate because, again, it undercuts the idea that Europe is exceptional for having produced, the richest or largest philosophical tradition. It really hasn't. These philosophical traditions are all much bigger than anyone could ever know about. Completely.
Okay. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. I thank you on behalf of Felsefelogos, philosophical, our philosophical journal, Felsefelogos, and I hope to see you again.
Okay, thanks again. Thanks for having me on.
Bye bye.
Bye.